Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully you're having an amazing day. I'm going to kick this video off discussing a new revision of the PlayStation 5. At the moment this only seems to pertain to the digital edition of the machine, but probably, and this is my guess, it will also impact the disc-based version as well. Allegedly, these systems will start to ship at the end of July, so it won't be long until they start to appear in store shelves. And we know this now because of multiple different Japanese websites which have actually listed this model, the new model by the way being CFI 1100B01, just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Now there are two differences between this and the launch model, at least what we know about anyway. The first is that it comes with thumb screws for the base, not a huge deal I grant you, but still, it's worth noting. And the second is that it's 300 grams lighter than the launch model. Now, it's worth noting that that weight could be from numerous different changes. The first is just plain the assembly of the case itself with the way that the base actually attaches to the console. I personally do not believe that this is the 6nm revision of the console, which Sony allegedly will be going towards, because I don't think it's quite late enough in the system's launch cycle for that. I think that's going to come later. I've discussed the 6nm revision previously, so I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. But basically, it's just produced on TSMC's 6nm process, and essentially 6nm is just an enhanced version of 7nm. So there's not a huge improvement. It's not like the jump from, let's say, 7 to 5nm. And speaking of 5nm, I have already leaked previously that I had heard Sony had tapped TSMC's 5nm process for a future console based on the PS5. However, whether that's still going ahead or not, I honestly don't know. To my knowledge, they'd even been asking AMD's semi-custom design teams to help them with the transition, but again, Sony's plans could have changed last minute. So I don't think it's based on that. So it could be, as I mentioned a moment ago, just a very simple change just to accommodate the base, or it's also possible that there are some other subtle internal changes for the system. What could those be? Well, it could be anything from lighter fan assemblies, small changes to the heatsink and fan in general, which it would be interesting if they did do this because, one complaint about the PS5 is that the GDDR6 memory, while it is technically running within temperature specification, small subtle changes could possibly reduce temperatures a little bit. Although, honestly, you can say the same of any console ever. The Xbox Series X as well could have its ventilation improved with minor changes, but yeah, it's kind of like as long as it's operating within specification and the console doesn't thermal throttle or risk going kaboom, does it really matter? So it's possible that there is that, or other minor changes to the PCB of the system itself, or just plain other internal components such as, for example, power delivery. I'm going to be very curious to see what Sony have done, because let's be honest, Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, even Sega back in the day, there were so many different iterations and revisions of the system. I mean, just looking back at Sega, for example, on their 16-bit offering, the Genesis or Mega Drive, whatever you want to call it, yes, everyone knows that there was like the Genesis 1 and the Genesis 2, with the Genesis 2 being, smaller. Technically, it was also like a Model 3 as well, but let's not talk about that one. However, even the big revisions and the small revisions had multiple different changes, and exactly the same thing for the Xbox 360, the PS3, the PS4, the Xbox One, and oftentimes they are very minor, very, iterative changes, and other times they can be pretty big ones. For example, of course, back in the day with the Xbox 360, you had two different chips for the CPU and the GPU, then basically Microsoft made them hunk together and basically turned them into a SoC. So it's going to be interesting to see what Sony do in their journey to both cost reduce the PS5 and make it easier to mass produce, because obviously both of those things are extremely important. Again, I don't think this is probably going to be a major change. However, I'm basing this just on the fact that honestly, 300 grams is not that big of a difference, so I don't think it's the 6nm process. However, I would be very happy to be proven wrong here, as it would be interesting to see what the temperature differences between the systems would be. And next up, I want to give you guys a quick update for the 11900K. Yeah, I know the tweet does technically say KS, but Raichu did clarify that it was an actual typo, so it is just a 12900K. However, it is a qualification sample, it's not overclocked, and it's running on a water cooler. No specifics as to the setup of the hardware. So for example, we don't know what type of memory it was using, the clock frequency of the memory timings, or any of that, which obviously can hugely influence the performance of the part. Nevertheless, we have a Cinebench R20 score, and the single thread performance is 810, and multi is 11,600. So how does that compare against the 5950X? Well, I don't actually have my 5950X results on hand. Ironically enough, they're actually on my 5950X, which is currently sat under my desk because I'm doing photos of something else. So I'll just quickly nip over to Guru 3D, so full credit to them. Yeah, the 5950X they've got is 643 points, and their 5950X in multi-thread is 10,409. From memory, I think my score was 650 or 649 or something like that in single thread, and I think like 10,500 in multi, but that's from memory, so I could be slightly wrong on that. Either way, too long didn't read. Alder Lake is doing really well against Zen 3. However, there are a few caveats. Now, Raichu has also stated, please do not be happy too early. Power consumption will become one of the biggest questions. It may be over 200 watts in full turbo frequency easily. The easily part is kind of concerning. However, again, because they've not provided a ton of clarification on this, it's very difficult to know what type of workloads they would be, whether it's gaming or very heavy AVX workloads or whatever. Who knows? I also want to say there's been a ton of debate regarding the prices of these parts, because we've seen some engineering samples that have got, or qualification samples. There's also debate actually of what SKUs they actually are, but we'll just call it early silicon. And they've been going on sale in China for like $1,000 US. And yeah, I mean, my personal feeling is that Intel are not going to be, let's say, I don't think they're going to undercut the price of the 5950X's MSRP at launch. Let's just say that. I think that these are going to be pretty expensive parts, also based on the process that Intel are using and a ton of other obvious factors. But, you know, the question also becomes, how will Intel compete against the V-Cache Ryzens when they launch, and what will AMD do in terms of pricing? I think, for me, the real story here isn't whether AMD or Intel win, it's that actually Intel are better able to fight back. The 11900 and so on. I mean, there were some nice SKUs in Rocket Lake, like the lowest end SKUs were actually quite interesting. But yeah, overall Rocket Lake wasn't quite what we were hoping for. But I do have some hope for Intel's Alder Lake, and certainly, you know, parts after Alder Lake do start to get better for Intel. It's going to be very interesting in the next 12 months, I think, for CPUs, or at least, you know, until end of 2022, possibly early 2023, because Zen 4 is going to be really just astounding. So, yeah, it's going to be very curious to see how Intel can fight back in a lot of different market segments, because of course it's not just desktop. We're also referring to HEDT, when obviously AMD have just been bending Intel over a barrel and kind of spanking them, because it's very hard for Intel to compete against the you know, Threadripper Pro's 64 cores, and then obviously servers, it's, well, yeah, kind of brutal. And now we're going to hop, skip and jump to a 6600 XT. Allegedly, this card is going to launch in August, specifically the 11th of August, and there's actually been a number of leaks for this, including various images of the card. And yeah, I mean, it isn't that special to look at these particular photos. The source of this is Beidou. Unfortunately, it's now been removed, and there's also a benchmark. Predominantly, I want to discuss the benchmark itself, as it's not a benchmark which is particularly well known, at least here in the West. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but Ludeshi, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. Again, I apologize if I didn't. And you can see this, well, the scores and stuff on screen yourself. And what's really interesting about these scores is that, well, it actually performs faster than an RTX 3060 Ti. In fact, it's basically on par with the 3070 Ti, which, that sounds amazing, right? Yeah, I mean, here's the thing though, I don't think those scores are going to be reflective of what we see in games. I mean, again, I would be really happy to be proven wrong on this, but I'm fairly skeptical that it will be. Personally, I think it's going to be nipping at the heels of the 3060 Ti and probably beating the 3060 in most benchmarks. Again, this has been, you know, from what I've been told for a while, that was kind of the performance targets of the 6600 XT. And if you think about it, a card which is basically a 3070 Ti, which isn't that far off of a 3080 for a 6600 XT, it doesn't really make sense, you know, just from a price performance perspective. It would, you know, it would basically torpedo AMD's, well, it would torpedo several of their SKUs. I was about to say, you know, some of their more expensive offerings, but it would torpedo so many cards, especially if this card does overclock well. Other than that, it is of course based on Navi 23 Silicon, 2048 stream processors, and it will all be powered by 8 gigabytes of memories. So yeah, I mean, it looks a pretty nice card, and I do suspect it will perform pretty admirably. Final thing, since we've been discussing graphic-y stuff, and that is there is another major update to NVIDIA's DLSS, although this is probably going to be less interesting, at least to some of you, if you're not a games developer. But basically you can now freely download the SDK from NVIDIA themselves. I'll link to it in the video description if you're interested. And this is a plugins. So basically you can now plonk it with custom/proprietary engines, whereas previously you would obviously have plugins specifically for Unreal Engine or Unity. And this updated release, which is now version 2.2.1, actually gives you more options for games developers. So what changes are there for version 2.2.1? Well, there are several of them. The first is that developers now actually have a slider to adjust sharpness, which I don't really think I need to discuss what a sharpness filter does. The second is that there's support for Linux, and this one's actually a pretty big deal, at least in my opinion. Again, it pretty much says what it does on the tin. So now you can integrate DLSS into Linux games as well as applications. And this is actually a pretty big deal because, well, obviously it doesn't really, you know, require me to tell you that Linux is quite popular. And for NVIDIA to now support it with DLSS, it's quite a nice thing. Third option, is that there's auto exposure option, and this allows it to automatically calculate exposure values. So this is for mostly low contrast scenes. And there's also a plethora of bug fixes and stability improvements as well. Anyways, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. Apologies for not being on camera for a second day in a row. As I mentioned, I'm kind of working on a couple of projects, but should be back to normal tomorrow. Well, at least my version of normal. I'll see you soon, guys. Have an amazing day. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.